They said present your mightiest beast, and the hall erupted before we even opened the crate because the scanner readout said one sleepy reptile from a hot island, and the crowd began to chant slow lizard while our ambassador tried to smile and the camera red light was on, and every child on Earth was watching, and the crate door slid up and the Komodo took a single unimpressed step and licked the air like it was tasting the joke of the century, and that was the moment the galaxy decided Earth was funny. No one had prepared me for how shiny the council chamber would be. It was a cathedral of chrome, an orchestra of lights, a place built to make anyone from a humidity-drenched planet feel small. I was translator third class for the Earth mission, which meant my job was to stand perfectly still, look moderate, and covertly signal if a phrase would offend the slug diplomats or the cloud beings. The galactic lords arrived one by one on floating thrones, draped in robes so reflective they could blind a person who forgot their glasses. Their banners unfurled, the crowd of delegates shook with anticipation, and the great announcer intoned the ceremony of power. Each world would display a living emblem of what it could bring to an alliance. A creature. A champion. A story with teeth. The first throne belonged to the sovereign of Talaris. They released a beast that crackled with static as if lightning had learned to walk. It padded along on half-visible legs and made the air taste like metal. The crowd cheered the way people cheer a storm that knows their names. A dozen more champions followed, and each one arrived with theatrical menace. There was the Moon Eater of Hectra, smaller than legend but still large enough to snack on a yacht. There was the Mantled Singer from the nebulous shipyards, a creature that weaponized sound into ripples that made the floor tremble. There were beasts that folded gravity like fabric, beasts with eyes that wrote equations in the air, beasts whose every breath made a ribbon of fire. The lords nodded with the self-satisfaction of a cartel unveiling a new price list. Power had a look, and this was the look. Then the announcer called for Earth. Our ambassador, a patient woman whose smile had survived 6 budget committees and 3 coups, stepped forward with open hands. She had asked to borrow a theater voice from the chorus machine, but the lords had denied the request. They loved comedy and preferred a natural delivery. The crate rolled in on a low sled guided by drones. Inside lay one Komodo dragon. Thick, heavy, sun-brown, flicking its tongue with the mild curiosity of a tourist trying a new soup. The camera magnified its head until the scales looked like little shields. The crowd saw none of that. They saw a lizard that moved like a bored king. Laughter is different in a room with 500 species. Some heaved, some whistled, some produced delicate rainstorms of glitter that smelled like mint. The lords laughed hardest of all. One lord from Zargath Prime laughed until her throne had to stabilize her pulse. Another lord wiped a reflective eye plate with a cloth perfumed with the essence of superiority. A slow lizard, the captions transcribed across the galaxy, and the sponsors bought ad slots to sell snacks shaped like little forked tongues. The announcer sked in a way that translated as "bless your naive heart." The ambassador did not flinch. She spoke for trade, for shared science, for the stability Earth desperately needed. Whole cities back home watched on screens, because we had rationed power for this moment, because we needed someone with deep pockets and cold kindness to sell us the things we could no longer make fast enough. The lord from Zargath Prime was famous for sport. She leaned forward, a leisurely predator enjoying a buffet that bowed to her whims. She proposed a spectacle with the lightness of a person who never pays consequences. Place your lizard on our hunting moon for a single day. If it survives, Earth will be admitted to elite trade. If it fails, Earth will pay tribute in biomass and minerals for a century. The chamber hummed with approval. It was theater. It was cruelty wrapped in a bow called culture. The ambassador asked for the rules. The lord smiled without lips and said the rules are that there are no rules, only survival. I felt my mouth go dry, and not just from the dehumidifier drones that make every human cough by hour 2. Back in the preparation bay, the Komodo blinked at the bright lights and pressed its weight against the crate wall with the kind of patience that unnerves people who rush for a living. A zoologist from the Indonesian delegation stood close by, whispering the steady calm of a person who has measured fate in field notes. She explained to the handlers that this was not a pet and not a toy. It was a patient hunter with bacteria and venom, a creature whose bite was a promise the body kept later. Someone from logistics asked if we had made a mistake by not selecting something flashier, perhaps a bear with a helmet. The zoologist did not glance up. She said patience is not absence of danger. The Earth delegation argued in soft voices heard only by our own tired ears. The ambassador listened, hands folded. The calculations on her pad were terrifying in their simplicity. If we refused the bet, the lords would likely blacklist us as humorless and weak. If we accepted and lost, we would pay for generations. If we accepted and somehow won, Earth would gain access to the materials we needed to keep hospitals lit, and crops stable, and sea walls honest. We needed the deal. We needed a miracle that did not look like a miracle, because miracles make for poor policy. She accepted the wager on record. The council recorded the decision in a light script that crawled across the ceiling like a constellation learning to spell. The transport pod resembled the inside of a pearl, smooth and faintly luminous. The Komodo did not care. It lay still, conserving energy the way a banker conserves kindness. A camera floated near its head to capture every blink. Across the galaxy, channels ran trailers for the event with enthusiastic absurdity. The slow lizard tries to find lunch before it becomes lunch. A commentator from the Rim colonies predicted 2 minutes of survival, which was merciful compared to the 3 seconds offered by a betting syndicate. The zoologist checked the harness one last time and slipped a small sensor under a scale. She looked into the camera and said, "This animal is not fast, but speed is not the only way to win." The feed cut away before anyone could hear my whisper that we should also probably pray. They dropped the pod toward the hunting moon with a ceremony of fanfares that felt like someone laughing in a library. The moon surfaced in the viewport as a mosaic of biomes stitched together by cruel architects. There were forests that breathed spores and rivers that carried fragments of volcanoes and plains where rocks uncoiled to reveal teeth. The lords had designed it so that every animal that thought itself clever would very quickly meet an environment that disagreed. It was a gallery of metaphors about hubris, all of them sharpened to points. The hunting moon did not wake gently. Light there was a sudden thing, a blade pushed between the ribs of night. In one moment the land was a jagged silhouette, in the next it was an unforgiving stage. The plains stretched out in bronze and black. The forests shimmered with a thin mist that smelled faintly of iron, and the mountains wore collars of steam where molten streams slid like living rivers. The announcer's voice bled into every broadcast channel with the relish of a cook lifting the lid on a pot. Today, we witnessed the most curious gamble in the history of the hunt. The camera drones circled above the ridge where the Komodo dragon lay, their lenses trembling in the rising thermals. The lords in their gallery adjusted their thrones and leaned forward as if to sip the day's entertainment. Bitey, as the Earth delegation insisted on calling him in quiet defiance of protocol, lifted his head with the slow care of a creature who knew every move cost energy. His tongue flicked out twice, tasting the change in the air. From a distance, to the lords, it looked like indecision. To the zoologist standing beside me, it looked like a map being drawn and sent. Somewhere in the mist, predators were stirring, creatures bred in laboratories where morality was an optional setting. These hunters had been designed to end hunts quickly and to do so in ways that kept audiences invested. The first of them appeared just beyond the treeline. It moved with the smoothness of an oil spill, all muscle under patterned scales that shimmered when the light hit. Its head was narrow, its jaw studded with teeth that curved backward, the kind of design that suggested evolution had been bribed for extra cruelty. The lords chuckled in appreciation, knowing what this predator could do. The announcer named it for the viewers, describing its habit of severing the limbs of prey before delivering the final blow. It stood still, watching Bitey, confident that patience was a game it could win. Bitey did not return the stare. He stepped sideways, his body swaying slightly, and began walking toward the open plain instead of the forest. The lords erupted in laughter again, declaring the earth creature suicidal for abandoning cover. The predator followed, head low, tail slicing the air in anticipation. The cameras zoomed in to catch every step, broadcasting to millions who had tuned in to watch a quick execution. The predator closed the distance in bursts, each dash bringing it closer until it launched forward, jaws wide. The crowd inhaled as one. Bitey pivoted at the last possible moment, a movement so sudden it looked like the ground had tilted. His head snapped to the side, his teeth found the predator's front leg, and he clamped down with a force that registered on the nearby seismic sensors. The predator roared and shook violently, but Bitey released and retreated several meters, leaving a neat crescent of puncture wounds. The lords jeered that it was a meaningless injury. The zoologist beside me only smiled without showing her teeth. The predator resumed its approach, but there was something different in its stride now, a stutter in the front limb, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. It circled, trying to mask the change, but within minutes its breathing deepened and its tail dragged faintly along the ground. The announcer kept talking, his voice rising with false suspense, as if trying to convince the audience this was still a contest. The predator's eyes dulled. It staggered, collapsed, and began to convulse. The crowd's noise dropped by several degrees. In the gallery, one of the lords leaned toward another and muttered something that made the other's face stiffen. They had underestimated what the bite could do. Venom worked differently here than on Earth, the zoologist explained in a voice almost too quiet for me to hear. The alien biology of the predator was no shield against a toxin designed over millions of years to dismantle circulatory systems. The first opponent was dead in less than 10 minutes, a record of the wrong kind for the hunt. The lords recovered quickly, masking their unease with sarcasm. They called for the next release. From a metal gate on the far side of the plain came a creature that looked like two animals fused in a hurry. Its front half resembled a massive feline, all claws and muscle, while the rear half was segmented like an insect, ending in a stinger that dripped glowing liquid. It moved with the certainty of an apex predator that had never been refused a meal. The announcer detailed its many victories against opponents that should have been too dangerous to challenge. Bitey waited, still as a sun-warmed rock, until the creature was halfway across the plain. Then he moved. Not quickly, not even directly toward the opponent, but in a slow diagonal that brought him closer to the broken remains of the first predator. The feline-insect hybrid followed, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps thinking its prey was simply disoriented. When it stepped over the carcass, Bitey lunged. His jaws caught the soft tissue just above the rear leg, where the chitin gave way to skin. Again, the bite was brief, and again he retreated. The hybrid chased but soon stopped, its stinger drooping. The venom was working faster now, perhaps aided by the stress of the chase. Within minutes the creature swayed, its claws digging into the earth as if trying to hold on to life. Then it too fell, twitching until stillness claimed it. The crowd was quieter now. In betting halls across the galaxy, odds were recalculated in hurried whispers. The lords exchanged glances that were not meant for the cameras. This was no longer the comic interlude they had expected. This was a lesson in underestimating what does not look like a threat. Bitey resumed his slow patrol, tongue tasting the wind. He moved toward a cluster of black rock formations that jutted from the ground like the bones of something too large to bury. From above, the drones followed, their lenses zooming in on the texture of his scales, the deliberate placement of each foot. The announcer's voice wavered between awe and obligation, caught between the need to entertain and the need to acknowledge that something remarkable was unfolding. By the time the suns edged toward their cruel zenith, the gallery had grown quiet enough for me to hear the faint whisper of the air scrubbers. The first opponents had fallen in ways the lords had not predicted, which meant the next act would come with choreography meant to restore their narrative. The announcer's tone returned with a rehearsed flourish as a gate on the far ridge unsealed and something vast stepped into the light. "The Colossus of Zargath," said the voice, letting the name hang. The creature moved like a geological event given legs. Its hide was patterned in dull plates that overlapped like the armor of an ancient temple. Each step pressed a print into the soil deep enough to hold a small pond. Smoke rose lazily from vents along its spine, a reminder that the thing was part animal and part furnace. Its head swayed as if listening for earthquakes. It was not built for speed. It was built to turn any argument into a single sentence, and that sentence was final. The lords straightened in their thrones and I felt the mood shift from uncertainty to relief. This was spectacle again, the kind that washed away the memory of embarrassment. The bookies pushed a tide of new odds and the numbers scrolled in hot colors along the edges of screens across 1,000 worlds. The ambassador's hand stayed still at her sides, but the zoologist pressed her nails into her palm hard enough to leave crescents. She murmured facts the way a medic murmurs to a patient, listing weight estimates, describing heat exchange through the plates, predicting turning radius and blind spots, building a small raft of knowledge for us to hold when the wave broke. Bitey rose from his vantage on the black rock, head tilted the way a craftsman examines a tool left out in the rain. He did not hurry. He moved along the ridge until the slope took him into a ragged spill of shade, then descended in a lazy zigzag that put the rising wind to his back. To the untrained eye he looked disinterested. To the zoologist he looked like a diagram in motion. The colossus tracked him with the slow confidence of a creature that had never had to learn the meaning of caution. The distance between them closed like the end of a storybook. The first contact was not a dramatic collision. It was a pause. The colossus stopped, and bent its head to scent the air. Bitey stopped as well, angled just off the wind, and remained still long enough for the cameras to pull close. You could see dust clinging to the edges of his scales. You could see the minute movement of his flank with each breath. You could almost believe he was a carved thing set on a plinth by a trickster artist. Then he slid forward 3 steps, and those were the only footsteps that would matter. The colossus swung a foreleg to crush, a movement that tore a trench in the soil. Bitey flowed back and left, not running, simply not being where the blow landed. He circled as if measuring circumference. The great beast turned, and in that turn the zoologist breathed yes because the plates along the inner thigh gapped for an instant. Bitey moved with an economy that was almost beautiful in its lack of flourish. His head shot forward and his jaws found the seam where armor gave way to tendon. The bite was not long. It did not need to be. He clamped, wrenched, and released before the colossus could throw its weight sideways. Then he backed away, each step placed to conserve energy, the tip of his tongue tasting the air as if the world were a page and he was checking the footnotes. In the gallery a swell of laughter tried to rise and failed because the reaction within the colossus was not immediate. It took moments to show, and then it showed in ways impossible to ignore. The limbs stiffened, then trembled. The beast lurched to redistribute its mass, and the soil cracked. Its head swung as if to find the source of an insult, but there was no insult, only the truth of chemistry spreading like a rumor through the body, the kind of rumor that ends careers. The announcer began a litany of the colossus's previous victories, the cities it had trampled in tests, the furnace vents that melted spears. His voice bent into questions he did not ask. The great creature took another step and that step faltered. Breath came louder through the vents, smoke darkened, gait shortened. The gallery stilled as if the room were being photographed. You do not teach a crowd the idea of humility by preaching. You show them a slow collapse. The colossus sank to one knee and the shock traveled through the ground into my shoes. Bitey kept his distance, conserving, eyes bright in the heat haze. The zoologist spoke softly about how venom can be a patient engineer, how it unthreads systems in a sequence that looks deliberate because evolution is a meticulous editor. There was nothing for the colossus to fight. It tried anyway. It pushed itself up and stood for a heartbeat too long, then toppled with a sound like masonry finally giving in. Dust rose, and when it settled the beast's vents had gone from smoke to ghostly little breaths of steam. The announcer stopped. Across the galaxy there was a beat of silence so complete it felt like a thought. The lords moved first. Not with applause, not with acknowledgement, but with bureaucracy. An aide hurried to the lord from Zargath Prime and whispered, and her hand slashed the air as if cutting a ribbon none of us could see. The announcer cleared his throat and found volume he must have practiced in mirrors. By tradition, he said, a second phase of the hunt may be initiated when a challenger displays exceptional capacity. The phrase exceptional capacity carried the scent of a rule drafted an hour ago. The ambassador asked for clarification and received a cascade of ceremonial phrases that boiled down to we are changing the game because we can. The zoologist closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and began to map the terrain again. They released drones that laced the sky like silver needles and shifted the biome on the near plain. Vents opened and a low fog crept in, not thick enough to hide, just thick enough to distort. Panels in the soil retracted and uncovered a basin rimmed in glassy rock that hummed with a frequency that made my molars ache. 3 gates lit up. 3 predators emerged as if called by a single thought. The smallest was a ripple of muscle and bone, a thing that climbed air more than it ran. The largest trod the ground with the smug patience of a hangman. The third flowed like a cloak pulled by wind, only occasionally revealing the outline of limbs. The lords had abandoned theater for a stacked deck. The crowd, sensing the unfairness, leaned closer rather than away. We are not always our best selves when shown cruelty. The evening on the hunting moon did not arrive with coolness or comfort. It came as a slow turning of the light into a molten amber that deepened every shadow and made the air shimmer like liquid glass. The predators that remained in the forests and valleys had grown restless, their calls rolling through the terrain like echoes of something older than memory. The gallery above the arena had also shifted in mood. The lords were speaking less and signaling more, hands darting quick as thoughts to aides who hurried away in silent bursts of duty. Whatever plan they had carried into this spectacle was now in ruins, and the weight of salvaging pride pressed on them like armor too heavy to shed. The announcer, once a steady drum of amusement, had grown quieter between sentences, as though measuring every word against the growing unease. The ambassador stood with her back straight, but I could see the tension in her jaw. The zoologist beside her had stopped making predictions out loud and now only scribbled notes on a pad that displayed flickering maps of Baidi's movements. I stayed close, pretending to watch the screens but in truth studying the lords. It was clear they had reached a decision. This was no longer about a fair hunt. It was about ending the story before it slipped entirely out of their control. Without ceremony, 3 enormous transport gates rumbled to life on the far side of the arena. The sound rolled across the plains like distant thunder. The announcer found a scrap of his earlier enthusiasm and told the audience that in a rare gesture of honor, the lords had decided to accelerate the hunt to its final stage. His words were careful, but the intent beneath them was clear. Baidi would face more than one apex predator at a time. The zoologist inhaled sharply and whispered that this was a violation of every agreed tradition. The ambassador reminded her softly that traditions here only lasted as long as they served those in power. The gates opened and from them stepped 3 nightmares from the most guarded vaults of the Lord's breeding programs. The first was a serpent-like creature whose body was ringed with luminous spines that hissed when they cut the air. The second was a hulking quadruped with jaws so large they seemed to belong to a different proportion of reality. Its hide rippled with muscle that looked like coiled rope. The third was smaller but moved with a disturbing precision, as if every step had been measured against an invisible pattern only it could see. These were not simply predators. They were weapons, honed to break spirits as easily as they broke bone. Baidi was still on the high ridge when the gates released their charges. He watched them fan out across the plain, his head moving slightly as he measured their approaches. He made no move to retreat. The lords leaned forward, their faces reflecting the crimson light of the sunset as if they were illuminated from inside by some molten ambition. Around them the crowd had shifted into a strange, taut excitement, the kind that comes when victory feels inevitable but is not yet certain enough to taste. The first engagement came from the serpent. It slid across the ground in a series of impossibly fast coils, luminous spines throwing shards of light in every direction. Baidi descended from the ridge at an angle, either fleeing nor charging, but drifting toward a cluster of rocks that jutted like broken teeth from the soil. The serpent followed, spines flashing, and when it struck the motion was so fast the camera drones almost lost it. But Baidi was not there. He had stepped sideways at the last instant, and the serpent's fangs punched into the rock instead. The hissing spines sputtered as the creature writhed to free itself. Baidi darted forward, jaws clamping on the soft neck just behind the head, and then withdrew before the coils could close. The serpent twisted, trying to pursue, but the venom was already sinking in. The quadruped charged then, a low bellow shaking the air. Its speed was shocking for its size, and this time it caught Baidi across the flank with a sweep of its massive head, hurling him several meters into the dirt. I felt my stomach drop as he rolled, his limbs flailing briefly before he found his feet. The zoologist's voice was tight as she said ribs were likely broken. The quadruped pressed the attack, jaws snapping, but Bitey kept backing away just out of reach, each step drawing the larger predator closer to a patch of ground that shimmered faintly in the fading light. I realized too late it was one of the volcanic vents that dotted the terrain. The quadruped stepped on it, and the earth roared as superheated steam blasted upward, scalding the creature's legs. It stumbled, roared again, and in that moment Bitey lunged for the softer skin inside the rear joint. The bite was deep and quick, and then he was gone into the shadows, leaving the predator bellowing in pain. The third predator, the small precise one, had been circling all along. It struck now, low and silent, aiming for Bitey's neck. The impact knocked both to the ground in a tangle of limbs and teeth. This was no quick strike. It was a grinding wrestle for dominance, the kind that left the air heavy with the smell of blood. Bitey twisted, snapping at legs and belly, but the smaller predator held on, claws scoring deep lines across his hide. It was the kind of fight that did not end cleanly. Bitey rolled onto his back, bringing his hind claws up in a savage rake that tore into the predator's chest. It loosened its grip and he clamped down on the exposed throat, shaking once before pushing it away. The smaller predator staggered back, sides heaving, and collapsed in the dust. The serpent was motionless now, its coils slack. The quadruped still moved, but its gait was uneven, its eyes wide with pain. Bitey stood between them, blood streaking his scales, his sides rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. The crowd, which had been roaring moments before, was suddenly subdued. The lords' faces were set like carved masks. The ambassador's lips were pressed into a thin line, the zoologist's hands clenched at her sides. This was not the story the lords had wanted to tell. This was the wrong ending written in a language they did not control. The quadruped tried one final charge, perhaps driven by instinct, perhaps by the distant commands of the lords. Bitey sidestepped again, slower this time, but with enough space to avoid the crushing jaws. As the beast thundered past, he struck at the base of its tail, his teeth finding the gap in the thick hide. The quadruped's bellow broke into a choke sound and it stumbled, legs folding beneath it. The plain was quiet except for the distant sigh of vents and the faint hum of the drones. The announcer tried to fill the silence with praise for the predator's valiant efforts, but his words fell flat against the images streaming across every inhabited world. The so-called slow lizard from Earth had faced the best the lords could throw at him, and he still stood. Not untouched, not unhurt, but unbroken. The venom would do its work in the hours to come. The lords would need to decide if they wanted to release yet more opponents, or admit that they had been beaten at their own game. The dawn that followed was not quiet. It came with the low growl of machinery hidden beneath the hunting moon's crust and the restless agitation of the audience as they filed back into the gallery. Word of the previous day's events had spread across the galaxy faster than the official broadcasts could frame them, and now entire fleets were tuned in, some watching from deep space, others from the trading floors of distant stations where work had stopped so people could gather around screens. The lords knew the eyes of the galaxy were on them. They had lost the easy control of the narrative. There was only one chance left to reclaim it, and they had decided to use their most dangerous piece. The announcer's voice trembled with barely contained anticipation as he spoke of a creature so feared that it had been locked away for centuries. They called it the apex leviathan, the last predator designed before the lords declared certain genetic experiments too dangerous to continue. From the far side of the arena, a set of massive gates began to part. Steam hissed outward, carrying a metallic tang that made even the drones drift back. The ground trembled as something moved in the darkness beyond the threshold. Then it emerged, and for a moment even the most jaded spectators fell silent. The apex leviathan was vast, larger than any creature that had yet entered the hunt. Its body was a fortress of muscle and bone, its hide layered in overlapping plates that shifted with every step. 4 eyes glowed a cold white, scanning the terrain with mechanical precision. Its mouth, when it opened, showed 2 rows of serrated teeth, each long enough to pierce the flank of a lesser predator. The announcer recited its history in tones that were meant to inspire awe, listing the planets it had cleared, the champions it had ended, the times it had been brought out only to prove a point. Bitey stood on his ridge, tail low, head raised just enough to watch the giant approach. He did not move. The zoologist's hand hovered near the glass as if she could somehow reach through and guide him. The ambassador did not blink. The lords leaned forward as one, their polished faces gleaming in the pale morning light. The Leviathan took its time, each step deliberate, closing the distance without hurry. There was no need for speed when you were certain of the ending. When the attack came, it was sudden and brutal. The Leviathan lunged, jaws snapping with a force that cracked the rock underfoot. Bitey rolled away at the last possible moment, but even the glancing impact of the monster's head sent him skidding across the dirt. The gallery roared. The announcer declared the first strike, as if this were a game of points. Bitey regained his footing and began to circle, keeping to the edges of the terrain, forcing the Leviathan to turn its massive body again and again. The big predator followed, its eyes tracking every movement, calculating angles. The Leviathan was not only strong but clever. It herded Bitey toward the forest edge where the trees grew close together, their trunks wrapped in thorny vines that tore at anything passing through. Bitey darted between them, but the Leviathan crashed through with raw power, the vines snapping and curling in its wake. The camera drones kept their distance, broadcasting every movement. For several minutes it was a relentless chase, the smaller predator using speed and terrain, the larger using endurance and overwhelming strength. Then Bitey changed tactics. He slowed, letting the Leviathan close the gap, then veered sharply toward a low stretch of volcanic ground where heat shimmered above the soil. The Leviathan followed undeterred, but its heavy steps sank slightly into the softer crust. Bitey stopped near a fissure where a thin wisp of steam curled upward. He turned his head just enough to give the impression of fatigue. The Leviathan charged. At the last instant Bitey dropped flat, rolling aside so the monster's front leg came down directly over the fissure. The ground cracked and a blast of superheated vapor shot upward, engulfing the limb. The Leviathan bellowed, its voice shaking the air, but it did not fall. The injury slowed it only slightly, yet that was enough for Bitey. He lunged forward and bit deep into the softened joint just above the steaming wound. The gallery gasped. The lords' faces tightened. The Leviathan jerked its head, but Bitey had already released and was gone, sprinting for the nearest rocky outcrop. The monster turned to follow, but there was a hitch now in its gait. The venom was beginning its work, though it would take longer against such a massive creature. The announcer filled the pause with boasts about the Leviathan's resilience, telling the audience that no venom could fell it before it tore its prey apart. The zoologist murmured under her breath that biology did not care about pride. Bitey kept his distance, watching, waiting, circling wide enough to make the Leviathan work for every turn. The sun climbed higher, the light burning off the last traces of morning mist. The two predators faced each other across the open plain, each assessing the other. The Leviathan made another charge, this time feinting left before swinging its massive head to the right. The maneuver caught Bitey off guard and the force of the blow threw him into the dirt. The crowd roared again, sensing the end. The monster closed the distance, lowering its head to seize him. Bitey did not move until the last possible moment. Then, with a suddenness that shocked even the most seasoned hunters in the audience, he rolled toward the Leviathan's open mouth, and struck at the exposed flesh of the lower jaw. It was a dangerous gamble, putting himself within reach of those terrible teeth, but his bite found the soft tissue and tore free a strip before he pulled back. Blood poured from the wound, and the Leviathan's roar was choked with pain. The venom had more entry points now, more pathways into the great predator's system. The lords shifted uneasily in their seats. The announcer's voice grew strained as he insisted the fight was far from over. But the Leviathan was slowing, its movements just a fraction less precise, its turns a fraction wider. Bitey pressed the advantage, darting in for quick bites at the legs, the base of the tail, each attack followed by a retreat before the monster could retaliate. The venom's effects were cumulative, each drop pushing the creature closer to collapse. Minutes stretched into a tense eternity. The Leviathan's breathing grew ragged, its eyes flickering as if the light within them were faltering. Bitey kept moving, never letting the monster rest, his own exhaustion hidden beneath the steady rhythm of his steps. The crowd had grown quiet now, the spectacle replaced by a creeping realization that the outcome might not match the story they had been promised. The lords whispered among themselves, their polished expressions betraying the first hints of alarm. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The Leviathan staggered mid-step, one leg buckling under its own weight. It tried to steady itself, but the muscles refused the command. It sank to its knees, then to its side, the ground shaking with the impact. Its great head turned toward Bitey one last time, as if trying to understand how something so small had brought it down. Then the light faded from its eyes and it lay still. The day after the hunt ended, the gallery smelled like flowers that had learned to apologize. The lords returned to their thrones wearing faces so polished you could see the shape of your doubt reflected in them. Their announcer spoke in the solemn cadence of a judge reciting the weather. The wager would be honored. Trade rights would be granted. The hunting moon would close for a cycle of review and safety adjustments, a phrase that made several of the aides wince because safety had never been part of the sales pitch. The crowd applauded in a way that felt like the end of a long performance where the villain had accidentally tripped into a baptism. On Earth, the feed split into a choir of city squares as people poured into streets that had learned the choreography of celebration only on certain holidays. Children hoisted cardboard Komodos over their heads. Someone in Jakarta painted a smiling lizard on the side of a bus, and the driver announced to his passengers that he would accept tongue flicks as valid tickets for the day, and no one argued with a man who held the brake pedal like a destiny. Bitey was transported to a medical bay that looked like a cathedral and hummed like a hive. The staff moved around him with the steady reverence you reserve for sleeping gods and patients who bite. Scans traced fractures along his ribs, a shadowed history written in bone. The zoologist stood by, answering questions in a calm that suggested she would permit the galaxy to touch exactly none of him without permission. She said he needed rest and a quiet space and a diet that did not glow. A technician asked whether the diet could glow a little, and she said not unless you want him to learn to read by his own dinner. Bitey lay still under a halo of instruments, eyes half shut, tongue sampling the antiseptic air. He looked, as ever, unimpressed by the concept of history. The signing ceremony took place in a hall designed to make treaties feel heavier than gravity. The ambassador wore the same suit that had faced the laughter, and somehow it fit even better now, as if confidence were a tailor. The lords presented a contract that stacked clauses like bricks, some useful, some decorative, some intended to be doors that later turned out to be paintings of doors. Our lawyers had not slept. They had translated every flourish into its working meaning, and the ambassador insisted on language that forbade biological exploitation, prohibited the collection of Earth fauna for military breeding, and required joint oversight of any research derived from the hunt. The lords signed with a grace that pretended these clauses had always been their idea. Somewhere in the rafters the announcer whispered into a private line that the story had the right ending after all. Somewhere beyond the rafters 1,000 worlds posted clips of the moment Bitey tilted his head toward the Leviathan just before it fell and added captions about patience and small things that choose where to stand. Markets moved in the way markets move when pride collides with profit. Transport guilds lobbied to open new lanes to Earth. Investors who had once traded in jokes now traded in long-term contracts for desalination membranes and seed vault expansions. Earth corporations that had been an inch from collapse found themselves drafting plans that no longer smelled like panic. The ministry tasked with protecting ecosystems met in a room with bad coffee and made decisions that tasted like courage. A reserve was declared around every known Komodo habitat. Fences were built where they should be and unbuilt where they should not. An armed patrol floated above the islands not to guard against locals but to discourage entrepreneurs whose sense of wonder smelled like chloroform. The lords began their own work, which is to say they launched a campaign to edit memory. The official channels played long segments about the nobility of allowing challengers to win. The announcer recorded a special that insisted the Leviathan had been due for retirement, and that the true point of the hunt was cultural exchange. Audience responses did not comply. Clips of the laughter when the crate first opened were edited into montages of apologies. Memes proliferated. A very famous singer released a chorus that was nothing but a rhythmic tongue flick recorded at different speeds, and it charted on 3 planets because people like a beat that reminds them of a story that told the truth. A rumor spread that the Lord from Zargoth Prime had smashed a mirror, and then blamed the mirror maker for making a face look the way it did. The rumor was denied with exceptional vigor, which only ever helps rumors choose stronger shoes. In the quiet between ceremonies and interviews, I walked to the observation deck of the medical bay and found the zoologist staring at Bitey through the glass. She had the look of someone who has just read a sentence in a book she has studied her entire life and realized it had been written in ink that changed shade at certain temperatures. She pointed not at his wounds, which were neat and real and healing, but at the skin along his flanks where the outer layer had begun to loosen. She said, "He is shedding early?" I asked if that was unusual, and she said yes and no. Yes, because the timing was off. No, because stress and climate can alter schedules. Her voice was steady, but her fingers tapped a pattern against the data slate that suggested the thought under the thought was what mattered. The lab results arrived the next morning with the unhelpful efficiency of messengers who do not understand the weight of their news. The venom was changing. Not in composition so much as in concentration and delivery. Something about the alien proteins from the prey he had bitten, or the ambient chemistry of the hunting moon, or the heat had nudged the glands. The models predicted an increase in potency within a narrow range that would make little difference to herbivores but an enormous difference to large predators with certain circulatory architectures. In other words, he had adapted. The zoologist read the figures, exhaled through her nose, and said quietly that patience is not only a behavior. Sometimes it is a biological strategy that waits for the moment a lever appears.